Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. It is, a real privilege to be part of any internal meeting, particularly one just for members like this one. And it is fantastic to be back in historic Warwickshire, because here in Warwickshire, we are at the centre of England, not just geographically, but also, you could argue, socially and culturally as well. If you're a pollster, you know that it is Middle England, the voter in Middle England, who decides the fate of governments. And market researchers, well, they know that Middle England shoppers decide the fate of businesses. Well, Middle England is actually right out there. We're going to be hearing from them later on. And don't forget that Middle England is also at the fulcrum of vital historical events. The Battle of Edge Hill, a fantastic example, happened just a few miles from this spot in 1642. Edge Hill, the first engagement of the Civil War. And for the king, a bit of a disaster. I mean, things that started off going pretty well. The Royalist cavalry, led by Prince Rupert, put in this berserk charge, and they rip the entire left wing of the parliamentary army, chase them into the ground, sabre them into tiny little bits. And then they just keep going, completely out of control, disappear over the horizon, and they don't come back for hours. Now, if only Rupert had controlled his men, they could have reformed. They could have charged again. The king could have won that war in a single day. As it was, he had no cavalry support, the battle was a draw, the war dragged on, and he didn't get the result he was looking for. And the events of that day actually continue to play out today. The fate of our whole nation hinging on a few moments of madness. Now, the Civil War, of course, primarily a political conflict. But as always, there is an economic dimension as well. Because in the years before, England was confronting growing population, rising living costs, rising taxes, unemployment, religious and cultural change, and religious tension as well. And in fact, many of the same problems that we're still facing in Britain today. So economic change sets the scene for social and political flux. And the Great Depression, another really good example of this, because without the Great Depression, of course, it is unlikely that Hitler would have come to power in Germany. Therefore, World War II probably wouldn't have happened, at least not in the way that it did. And that sounds wonderful. But then again, without World War II, we would have had no surge in technical and scientific development, no UN, no widely accepted vision of human rights. Modern feminism wouldn't have happened, and the welfare state would not have been created on the ruins of post-war Britain. So major economic events like the Great Depression have world-changing consequences that unfold over many decades. And the same thing applies at a family level as well. I mean, my grandfather, born in Wearside during the Depression, in one of the poorest parts of Britain, if it weren't for the Depression, he wouldn't have moved from Wearside to Leeds to look for work. He wouldn't have got a job in a textile mill. He wouldn't have met my grandmother. My dad would not have been born in Leeds and wouldn't have gone to Leeds Grammar School. He wouldn't have gone to university, wouldn't have got a good job. I would have had a very different upbringing. And in fact, I probably would not be here today. Now, roll the clock forward to 2012, and it's obvious that we're actually now enduring a very similar period of traumatic change, because the banking crash has wiped out accumulated wealth on an unprecedented scale. It's also dramatically exposed the weaknesses of the euro system, and the whole thing clearly now built on very, very shaky foundations. But debt within the euro area, absolutely the biggest threat that we're facing in the UK today. It now seems very unlikely that the euro is going to survive in its current form. And that's a view, I think, reinforced by all the credit downgrades we've been hearing about in the last couple of weeks. And leaders across Europe are facing a difficult choice. You can either face decades of painful reform or a disorderly and disastrous debt default. And on this chart here, I'm trying to show you why it is that reform is going to be so painful. Because the issue isn't just how much money the Europeans are spending, it's actually what they're spending the money on. Now, what I've done here is I've divided government spending into three streams: paternal, maternal, and t'other. The paternal spending is the traditional functions of government, so that's things like defence and policing and anything sort of macho. Maternal spending is education, healthcare, social protection, pensions, and the green would be, administration and infrastructure and that sort of thing. So you can see how deeply Europe has committed to this idea of social welfare. Most governments spend more than half of their money on the maternal functions. And that's a serious weakness because as our populations age, we suddenly find that we're facing an open-ended commitment and that there are no obvious places to make cuts. It's hard to imagine any programme of cuts which is not going to hurt somebody somehow. And for a whole generation of Europeans who have been raised under the wing of the state, this is a really scary issue because people are realising it's not just their jobs and their pensions and their benefits that are at risk. The whole social contract, the whole construct, the relationship between the individual and the state is changing. And it's quite possible that the Europe of the future will be a bleaker and a harsher place than it is today. Decades of social progress are potentially going to be rolled backwards. And as always, it is the most vulnerable members of society who are at the biggest risk. Now, if we do see a default, what would happen? Well, I've listed here some of the consequences of a disorganised debt default. What we would be looking at is a further destruction of stored wealth. And there is no upside in that. Everybody would lose, including people outside the euro. And if somehow disaster is averted, what would happen then? Well, to be honest, it's going to look broadly the same, only slightly less severe and spun out over a longer period, because it's hard to imagine any solution to the debt issue which wouldn't involve investors taking a haircut, lots of QE, lots of inflation, and severe government retrenchment. Now, perversely, this could actually be quite good if you are in a grocery business, because for the moment, there's still lots of liquidity out there, lots of money sloshing about, and investors are looking for a safe place to put it. Obviously, they don't want to give it to governments. They'll be looking for investments that will perform for the future. And grocery businesses can be safe harbours. They're cash generative, they're international, they tend to be very well run, they have strong brands. And I think we can assume that retailers and suppliers of groceries are going to their investors with exactly that story. So it is worth asking whether cooperatives also have a reassuring story to tell to their members. And don't forget, of course, debt is not just a European issue. It's also the biggest single issue faced by the USA. And if the US were to default or even try to renegotiate its debt, I would expect widespread chaos across America. The collateral damage would engulf other nations, including our own. Now, by contrast with the West, the emerging markets of Asia actually seem to be doing quite well at the moment. But even in China, debt is an increasing concern, perhaps sufficient to burst the Chinese bubble. And until it does, well, it's the demand from Asia which is driving inflation and volatility in global commodity markets. As the supply situation tightens up, price volatility increases. And it's that volatility that can break both businesses and households. With the diplomatic situation in the Gulf, I think we can anticipate more big price rises for fossil fuels in 2012, and that will affect Southern Europe in particular. So lots of potential threats still out there, lots of bullets which businesses like the cooperatives are going to have to dodge. But really, it is uncertainty which is the most important theme. That uncertainty makes it very difficult to create any long-term plan or to forecast more than a couple of months ahead. And in that sort of situation, flexibility, agility, speedy decision-making, those things are vital to business survival and to business success. So a lot is going to depend on the ability of businesses to gather data, to process it, and to respond appropriately. Now, what about the UK? Well, you can see here the impact of the recent recession on the UK economy. This was the longest and the deepest recession since modern records began in 1953. It may well have been more severe than the Great Depression. We don't have quite the data we need to tell for sure, but certainly it was pretty nasty. And history tells us that we have to expect severe and long-term consequences. Now, the evidence that we have suggests that we contracted again at the end of 2012. We're still waiting for confirmation, but that is a worrying development, and certainly it greatly increases the chance of a double dip. And even if growth comes back, the recovery from this recession has been fitful by historical standards, and the government has been forced to raise taxes and accelerate austerity as a result. Now, household spending is about 2/3 of economic activity, and that's what you're looking at here. I want you to look at the blue lines first. The blue lines show you overall household expenditure in the UK. So you can see if you look at the solid line, expenditure is back in growth, and it's actually ahead of where it was when we went into the crisis. On the face of it, fantastic. But look at the dotty blue line. The dotty blue line is a continuation of the previous trend. That shows you what might have happened if there had been no banking crash and no recession. The gap between the two is an estimate, and I stress estimate, of the damage done by the recession. And you can see that the lines are actually parallel, so there's no sign that the shortfall in spending is being made up anytime soon. So the impact of the recession was permanent. Now look at the red lines. The red lines are the same data, but this time I've excluded the benefit of inflation. Okay? So it's quite clear now that actually, when you subtract inflation, household demand is still below where it was when we went into recession. And if you look at the historical record, it was inflation and not volume change that was fueling an awful lot of shopper-facing businesses. Now, as well as inflation, of course, we're also getting quite a benefit from population. If you strip out population as well, you can see that growth is even more subdued. Now, look at the red line here. The red line is household spending adjusted for inflation and population. And you can see that right now, demand in the UK is at best at the 2006 level, maybe lower. So if your business is doing better now than it was in 2006, you have achieved real growth and you are doing very, very well. And those charts, by the way, are fairly typical of the US and Europe. Now, normally, grocery is pretty robust during periods of recession. Sales usually hold up pretty well, and grocery is a defensive place to be. But this time around, it is different. Grocery categories are also suffering to some extent. And as Sean told us, grocery volumes appear to be going backwards slightly, especially when you adjust for population growth. Now, this obviously makes it very difficult for any business to grow. So, that's shopper demand. Where is it going to go next? Well, unfortunately, it is actually quite difficult to be optimistic about the future for consumer demand, because as you can see from this study here, this is a long-running study on consumer confidence from Nationwide, consumer confidence is still basically at a record low. And look at the red line. The red line is consumer views of the future. So you can see there's an abrupt kink. What you're seeing there is as we go into the recession, people are shocked at what's going on, but they're initially optimistic that things are going to recover quickly. Later on, it starts to dawn on people that actually this one is a particularly bad recession and recovery will be very, very slow. Shoppers, I think, are starting to understand that they personally are going to be at the front end of painful social changes. And Nationwide data actually backed up by our own research. This is some research from something we call Shopper Vista. We talk to 1,000 shoppers every month. And every couple of months we ask them where they see their household economic situation going over the next year. And you can see, in our latest phase of research, 47% of shoppers told us that they expect to be less well off in 2012. Only 13% expected to become richer. And that's, to be honest, that is probably realistic. Becoming less well off is going to be a severe psychological shock for an awful lot of households. Not just financial shock, but a psychological shock as well. Because over the years, I think a lot of us have got used to this idea that we're going to become effortlessly better off as time goes on. And for years, that view has been justified. You can see that between 1983 and 2010, household wealth increased in real terms every year. And that means that if you were in a shopper-facing business, to be honest, things were actually pretty good. It was an easy time to make money. The rate of change does slow down from the turn of the century onwards, but it continues to head in the same direction. Now, 2011 was the first year since 1982 that household spending power actually fell, and you can see it was an abrupt reduction. It's going to fall again this year, and it may not recover to the 2010 level before 2015 at the earliest. And don't forget that this forecast over here assumes that inflation stays low and under control. Obviously, if inflation starts to come back up again, then household spending power will take even longer to recover. So more bullets on the way, more hazards that are going to have to be dodged. And it's weak shopper demand, I think, which is going to be the key issue for pretty much all shopper-facing businesses. Because for years, we've all worked on this assumption that wealth will increase and per capita demand is going to grow. Now, if, as we anticipate, volumes stay static or actually fall, a lot of businesses, I think, are going to find that they are over capacity. And that's going to be exacerbated if more and more traffic switches to the online channel. Now, from the charts I've shown, it's pretty obvious that shoppers as a group are pessimistic about their own personal financial futures. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is fiscal reform. The government's policy regarding taxation and spending. And it's something that's in the news pretty much all the time right now. But the issue, I think, isn't the mathematics of tax and spend. The issue is really the relationship between the state and the individual. Now, you can see here a graph I've drawn for the UK over the last 200 years, and it shows you the scale and the nature of British government. And again, I've used the same three allocations for state spending. So you can see in the 19th century, the state is basically a paternal state. It's locked into a masculine mode. It's a very small state, and nearly everything it spends is on war fighting. From around 1920, you can see that not only does the state get bigger, the nature of the state changes in quite an abrupt way. Does anyone want to have a guess as to why? Well, there's a certain amount of war shock going on.
Promises that couldn't be made, that's when they start.
Oh, yeah, okay.
For heroes, work bill.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So we get a certain amount of war shock. We get the arrival of socialism as a mainstream economic and political idea. So the first Labour government is around this point. And one more thing happens. Women get the vote. Okay. Women getting the vote changes the nature of the state. It changes the nature of society. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but certainly it is massively expensive. And we are now starting to run into the buffers of what can actually be afforded. Hence, all of the political debate over austerity, and hence all of the dispute. Now, given all of the dispute you've seen in the press, you would think that the maternal state is going to be slashed away and destroyed. Actually, that's not true. When you look at the projections produced by the Treasury, the downturn in state spending is actually pretty minor. Okay? Now, what you've got there is a projection for the next 5 years, which I've taken from the latest Treasury report. And you can see that, yes, spending comes down, and yes, it is an abrupt deviation from the previous trend. But in fact, in itself, the downturn is quite small. It's even quite small when you look at it on a per capita basis. On a per capita basis, the government is going to be spending about 10% less per person 5 years from now. That's because the population is still growing. So the population is growing, and we're splitting less money across more people. Now, in itself, that's not too scary. But it's important to recognise that the measures that are being taken by the government now are not a one-off. It's actually the camel sticking its nose into the tent. What we're actually seeing now is the front end of an extended campaign of tax changes and expenditure cuts. And this chart here explains why. This, again, is based on government projections from July of last year. And it's a projection for state debt based on the assumption that the austerity programme is carried out and delivers what it's supposed to deliver, but nothing else changes. So you can see the debt peaks and then it comes down. But it never actually comes down to the pre-crisis level. And then from around 2030 onwards, debt goes through the roof because the population continues to age. Therefore, it's pretty clear that more reform will be required and that social pain is going to continue. Now, what sort of pain are we talking about? Well, vulnerability obviously is going to depend on your geography and your social group. The more reliant an area is on government spending, the greater the potential impact on shopper spending power. And the key measures to look at are things like benefit payments and public sector employment. Now, this chart here is showing you where UK household income is coming from. Across the country as a whole, about 8% of shopper income comes from pensions and disability. Those two things are probably sacrosanct. But the other benefits, which make up another 8%, are potentially going to be readdressed. But you can also see that the income profile varies quite widely. So Wales, Northern Ireland, the north of England, much, much more reliant on benefits. So the impact of austerity is going to be most acute in those places that are already vulnerable. Clearly, that is a particular issue for convenience stores like the ones that Sean was telling us about, because those convenience stores are most closely connected with the host community. This is what public sector employment looks like. And again, you can see it's the north of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland that are looking most vulnerable to austerity cuts. But in addition to that geographical variation, also look for demographic differences. We know that young people are disproportionately affected. They are going to be paying more into the state and taking less out. And families are also going to be severely affected. Now, this is a new study that came out last month from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And what it's showing you is projected change in household spending power over the next 5 years as a result of government reform. And it is the presence or the absence of children which is going to determine how vulnerable you are. So across all households, 5 years from now, people are going to be about 1% poorer. If you've got children in the house, it's more like 4 or 5%. And the bigger your family, the more vulnerable you are going to be. Now, you can see there's also particular effects for people who have caring responsibilities, so people who are caring for sick or elderly relatives. So what does that mean? Well, we know that women tend to do most of the grocery shopping. We know that women tend to shoulder the responsibility for looking after children, looking after relatives. And so I would see this as being primarily a feminine problem, or a feminist issue, I should say. That's probably more accurate. And potentially, one result of this may well be that the social and the economic position of women is actually rolled back as a result of these cuts. What we will see is perhaps us looking back on 2011 as a high watermark for social progressiveness in the UK. Now, bear in mind that this data, although it's quite scary, isn't quite granular enough to really capture the effect of austerity. Because we know that reliance on benefits in the public sector varies widely across communities, even across postcodes. So what we're going to see is the impact of austerity playing out street by street and postcode by postcode. And what that means is that the differences that already exist between communities are going to become amplified as time goes on. Now, let me show you what I'm talking about here. These are the differences that already exist. Now, I've taken here two neighbourhoods. Both of them are based around pubs, and both of the pubs are called the Swan. Now, one of those is my own local in rural Hertfordshire. The other one is in urban Manchester, probably not that far from Sean's office. Sorry, I should just point out, I'm in the south, I'm not from the south. And hopefully as I emphasise my northern credentials, I appear kind of tougher and grittier and more realistic. Now, you can see those two communities are already very, very different. And what's going to happen over time is that those communities are going to move apart. Okay. Why does that matter? Well, first of all, of course, if you're running a business, you're going to have to take those differences into account when you're deciding where you're going to put your stores and what you're going to stock. Second, the fates of these communities are not fixed. Areas that are currently upmarket may become downmarket and vice versa. So store locations that make sense now may not make sense in the future. The third point, communities and social cohesion are under threat. And that could manifest in many different ways. We've already seen riots in London, in Manchester and in other cities. The occupation of St Paul's, potentially another manifestation of this. I'm not sure how I feel about the occupation of St Paul's, and certainly the church itself seemed to be fairly conflicted. We know that Jesus threw the money lenders out of the temple. I'm not sure what line he would take against hippies. Now, to some extent, these Occupy protests are what I call ink blot protests, because you can read into them whatever you like. And certainly when I walked through the encampment, it seemed to have attracted every lunatic in central London. But it is quite clear that there are a large number of people out there who do not believe that big business is on their side. They see big business as potentially the enemy. And that means that if you are in business, whatever business you're in, what you must do is make sure that you are explicitly lining up with the good guys. Because if you're not one of the good guys, you will be assumed to be one of the bad guys. And what do you do with bad guys? You fight them. Okay. Fourth consequence of austerity is that the social impacts of what businesses do are going to matter much more. So I think we have to expect that the health and the social consequences of what businesses do are going to come under more and more scrutiny. And this is already happening, because government knows that in future is not going to be in a position to pick up the tab for alcohol abuse, smoking-related diseases, eating of junk food. It will be expecting business to take more responsibility and to shoulder more of the financial burden. Hence things like the public health responsibility deal, which an awful lot of food businesses have signed up to. So more bullets out there which must be dodged. But perhaps the most urgent one is the impact of austerity on our communities. Now, so far, we've only had limited austerity. But over the next couple of years, maybe even over several decades, the effect of austerity will accelerate. And we actually have no idea what that's going to mean, because we have no relevant historical knowledge. All we can say for sure is that change is coming, and change will be severe. Some good news. Inflation actually seems to have peaked, which is excellent. So over the next year or so, slack demand and high comparables are going to see the inflation picture tracking downwards. So great news if you are an individual shopper. Now, shoppers, I think, in particular, still very, very concerned about inflation. And you can see when we ask people about what they see food prices doing over the next couple of years, they're still thinking very much about the price picture. Hence, all of the concern that Sean expressed about getting pricing right. And certainly, again, shoppers still looking for very practical ways to try to save money. They expect businesses to actually help them to save money over the next couple of years. And they will be putting a lot of effort into this. Because when we ask shoppers how it is that they intend to pursue price, well, they adopt a number of different strategies. Some people actually just don't move. That's the blue section on this chart. Some people simply accept lower quality. So they say, well, I've got to save money. I've simply got to trade down and buy less yummy food. But on the other hand, a very significant number of people, perhaps half of the people in this room right now, exert more effort in the shopping process in order to protect their economic situation. So whereas a couple of years ago we saw people spending money in order to save time, looking ahead, they see themselves as doing the exact opposite. So they're using time in order to save themselves money. Earlier, I spent a lot of time talking about demand issues. Demand issues huge for retailers, because not only do they affect sales performance, they also undermine the effectiveness of the business models. Because for the last 20, 30 years, grocery retailers across Britain and across Europe have to some extent all been following basically the same business model. It's a volume-led business model. You cut your prices, you drive your volumes, you cut your costs, and you cut your prices again. And for years, this has worked. But it does depend on two things. First of all, it depends on the ability of the retailer to extract cost from the business, and often cost from suppliers. And secondly, it relies on the ability of shoppers to continue to buy more as the prices come down. Now, both of those things are now huge question marks. First of all, we've seen that in a high-cost, high-inflation environment, it's getting very, very difficult to pull cost out of the business. And secondly, the willingness of shoppers to buy more stuff is also extremely questionable. And therefore, it's this need to keep EDLP, the everyday low price model, going under less than ideal conditions, which helps to explain an awful lot of the concerns that retailers had. Because I'm sure that if we went to pretty much any cooperative retail boardroom and tracked what they were talking about during the course of their meetings, pretty much all of their time would be spent thinking about these three things. Either getting more loyalty out of the shopper. So if shoppers aren't spending any more, you've obviously got to make sure that they spend a larger proportion of their wallet with you. Driving cost out of the business or trying to drive value. Now, Sean already talked about where we think the grocery market is going to go, so I'm not going to rehash what he said, except to say that we are very confident about the future of small urban grocery stores. We do think that these are going to be key growth drivers over the course of the next couple of years, and therefore that the cooperative movement is in exactly the right place. But I do want to leave you with one last thought. Now, 2011 was a banner year for UK grocery because it was the last year, so it was the point at which all of the major retailers had a store offering in all of the different routes to market. So we saw, as Sean said, we saw Morrisons and Waitrose kind of filling in the last little bits of their retail portfolios. And we know that, so we're looking at a future which is going to be dominated by multi-format grocery retail. And development of that multi-format retail is a response to shopper agility, because we know that shoppers become more agile in hard times. And they become more and more responsive to the different value offers that are available. And when you ask shoppers, why is it that you shop across so many different store types? They tell you, well, the key reasons are to get the promotions and to save money. So what's happening here is that we've made it easier than ever for shoppers to cherry pick the best deals, to cherry pick the best prices from retail. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why those retail shares haven't really gone anywhere. Because as we've poured more and more money into promotion of grocery products, what we've done is we've simply begun to chase a small group of extremely mobile shoppers round and round the marketplace at huge cost. Clearly, this isn't something that can go on. Sean said 40% of branded groceries are now sold on promotion. It's not sustainable. And one response that retailers are going to be using over the next couple of years is to use loyalty schemes to target their rewards in a more rational way, to reward loyalty and not disloyalty. The last set of bullets for you to think about. Firstly, remember that inflation is easing, but that doesn't mean that the pressure on businesses is also going to ease. And secondly, as shoppers reconsider many of the shopping decisions they make, what we must do is to make sure that our businesses are suited for a very frightened, a very cash-strapped, and frankly, a very disillusioned and disheartened grocery shopper. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, James.